When the ceiling came down, it did not fall like concrete. It came apart in sheets, as if the cold had preserved the room as a memory rather than a structure, and memory had finally decided it was done pretending to be solid. Frost burst from the seams in white plumes. The overhead lights swung once, twice, then went black. In the dark I could still see the corridor, not with my eyes but with that other sense the place used on me, the sense that showed me every version of a thing at once. Grant at the far end with the detonator. My sister standing beside him, though she was 28 and 12 and missing and dead all at once. My own hands slick with somebody else's blood. The voices had already started by then. Not from the speakers. Not through the radios. From the walls. From the steel bunks bolted to the floor. From the layers of ice sealed behind the concrete where heat had never reached. They spoke in overlapping tones, dozens of them, patient and curious and terribly familiar. Noah. Grant yelled something I didn't catch. My sister held out the carved wooden token, the same one I had thrown into rivers, snowbanks, burn barrels, and hospital sharps containers, and every time it had come back to my pocket like a decision I hadn't made yet. Then she smiled with a mouth that remembered her better than I did. "Please," she said, "don't make us forget again." The floor lurched. The charges went off below us. And for one impossible second, before the corridor split open beneath my feet, I understood that I had been the thing's rescue call all along. 3 months earlier, I took the job because it gave me legal reasons to go places grief had already taken me illegally. Aurora Response Services operated out of a low steel building 40 miles north of Anchorage, tucked between a state maintenance yard and a fenced equipment lot full of tracked vehicles. Officially, they were a private wilderness emergency contractor. They serviced villages off the road system, fishing camps, pipeline crews, survey teams, guided hunting parties, isolated lodges, and whatever else could still pay for evacuation when normal ambulances stopped being useful. Unofficially, based on the way the interview went, they also serviced something nobody wanted to say out loud. I had been an EMT in Washington before Alaska, then an ER tech when my back started reminding me I wasn't 20 anymore. I had enough field hours to look competent on paper and enough restlessness to seem willing. The operations director, a narrow woman named Celia Vance, read my file twice before she asked why I wanted remote work. "Better pay," I said. That was true, but only in the way a bandage is true about a fracture. My sister Lily had vanished 5 years earlier on a solo hiking trip east of Healy. Search teams found a parked rental, a partly used bear spray canister, and nothing else. No blood, no pack, no clothing, no remains. People said that happened in Alaska. They said the wilderness was big enough to keep what it wanted and indifferent enough not to explain itself. I had spent 5 years discovering how quickly probably becomes the only condolence anybody can offer. Aurora's coverage maps reached into areas ordinary county resources barely touched. Their dispatch archives included coordinates, incident summaries, and private access routes. I didn't expect miracles. I expected proximity. Sometimes that is enough to ruin a man. They hired me after a physical, a wilderness protocol module, and a sober little lecture about weather, isolation, and radio discipline. Nobody mentioned rules. Nobody mentioned marker line 7. The employee handbook was thick with things you'd expect: medication accountability, wildlife precautions, medevac transfer procedures, village liaison etiquette. If there were stranger pages, they weren't given to new hires. My first week passed in procedural gray. A laceration at a cannery. Chest pain in a village schoolteacher flown to Palmer. A snow machine rollover near Talkeetna that ended with a broken clavicle and a drunk apology repeated so often it stopped sounding like language. Routine work in difficult country. The sort of work I knew how to do. Then, on my 9th day, dispatch sent me to a distress beacon north of the old Interior Survey corridor, beyond a derelict weather monitoring station that had not appeared on the map packet they handed me. The coordinates came through just before dusk. Rotor conditions were bad, so they dropped me and my partner 2 ridgelines over with a tracked utility sled and told us to finish the last miles by ground. My partner was a contract pilot medic named Royce. He had the habit of glancing at me as if checking whether I understood the punchline to a joke nobody had told yet. When dispatch read the coordinates, he went quiet long enough for me to notice. You been out there before? I asked over the engine noise.
No.
It was the kind of lie people tell out of politeness, not conviction. The weather station sat in a clearing like a burnt tooth. Its mast had collapsed years earlier. The equipment shack was half buried. One wall peeled open by freeze-thaw and wind. Beyond it the spruce thickened into black vertical lines, the kind of timber that erased distance. The beacon pulsed beside an overturned sled 20 yards from the shack. A woman sat on a drift log near it. At first glance she looked textbook. Mid-30s, pale, possible leg injury, inadequate clothing for exposure. She wore no hat or gloves, only a dark sweater and snow pants damp at the knee. Her hair was pinned back with a silver clip that had gone green with age. She watched us approach without waving. Royce stopped walking. I nearly walked into him. What? He didn't answer. His face had changed the way faces do when they stop belonging to the present. I went around him and approached the patient alone. I'm Noah, I said, kneeling. I'm with Aurora Response. Can you tell me your name? She smiled as if I'd said something tender. Her eyes were wrong, though it took me a moment to understand how. Not clouded. Not unnatural. Just familiar in a way that suggested memory before sight, like recognizing a voice from another room. You came faster this time, she said. The sentence made no sense. I checked her pulse. Her wrist was cold enough to sting my fingers. Not cool from exposure. Cold. The deep, dry cold of metal left outdoors. I looked back at Royce. He had not moved. He stood near the sled with one hand on the radio clipped to his vest and his face turned slightly away, as if refusing to look full at us might matter. Ma'am, I said louder now. I need your name. Instead of answering, she reached into her pocket and drew out a small carved object no bigger than my thumb. It was wood, smooth dark with handling, shaped crudely like a person with no face. She held it between us on her open palm. For the road, she said. I should have refused it for obvious reasons. Patient belongings should be logged. Unknown objects in wilderness scenes should be treated carefully. If I'm being charitable to myself, I can say I took it because she was hypothermic and I wanted compliance. If I'm being honest, I took it because the moment I saw it, something in me loosened with recognition. My hand closed around the carving before I had decided to move. The woman's smile widened just enough to make me feel ashamed, though I didn't know of what. Good, she said. You remembered me. Royce shouted my name. I turned. Could not have been more than half a second. When I looked back, the drift log was empty. No tracks led away from it. No woman. No blood. No sled wreck worth mentioning. The distress beacon still pulsed by itself in the snow like a patient heart. I stood there holding the token while the dark came on between the trees. Back at base, they did not debrief us in the usual room. Celia Vance met us in the vehicle bay with Grant Halvorson, the senior field medic everybody deferred to without ever sounding friendly about it. Royce said almost nothing. I gave my report from habit, clean and chronological. Beacon activation, female patient, apparent lower extremity injury, abnormal skin temperature, temporary loss of visual contact, seen clear on secondary search. Then I mentioned the carving. Celia went still in a way I had only seen in trauma bays right before someone called a time of death. Grant asked, "Did you keep it?" I opened my hand. It was there, warm from my pocket, though I did not remember putting it there. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The vehicle bay heater clanged somewhere above us. Outside, a loader reversed with a distant warning beep that sounded absurdly ordinary. Finally, Celia reached into a drawer in the dispatch desk and removed a laminated card with a hole punched through one corner. She handed it to me without touching my skin. There are supplemental field rules, she said. You should have received them after probation. I looked at the card. 4 bullet points in small black type. Rule 1. Never accept gifts from patients found beyond marker line 7. Rule 2. If dispatch repeats your coordinates twice, immediately leave the area. Rule 3. Never transport a patient who refuses to give a name. Rule 4. If you encounter someone listed as deceased, do not acknowledge recognition. I read Rule 1 twice, Then I looked up at the room full of people trying not to look frightened. What happens if you do? No one answered at first. Grant did, eventually. He had the dry, careful voice of a man who had learned that truth needed to be portioned out like medication. Usually, he said, you disappear. I did not disappear. That became the problem. For the first 48 hours after the weather station call, I slept with my room light on in company housing and woke at every sound in the hallway. I half expected to find the woman standing over my bed or Lily sitting in the corner in the old blue jacket she wore the last winter we lived in the same apartment building. I considered walking into Celia's office, putting the token on her desk, and resigning before whatever came for me had to search too hard. Instead, nothing happened. At least not in the way everyone expected. What happened was harder to explain. 3 days after the weather station call, a helicopter came in hot during a supply transfer because of an undiagnosed hydraulic issue in the tail rotor assembly. I had been helping unload 4 kits and warming blankets. An impulsive thought made me step away from the skid and into the snow 10 seconds before the rotor shuddered. The pilot chopped power, and a crate of oxygen cylinders crashed exactly where I had been standing. Nobody was badly hurt. One mechanic fractured his wrist. Later, in the maintenance hangar, he told me if I'd stayed where I was, I would have been pulped against the cargo rack. A week after that, I was part of a ground response restocking a medical cache near a steep cut where avalanche advisories had been moderate, not severe. I stopped to retie a bootlace. It irritated me because I knew the knot had been secure. 30 seconds later, a slab released high above us, crossed the route we had intended to take, and buried the supply sled beneath 6 feet of snow. We lost 2 hours digging gear out and nobody died. Grant watched me through the blowing powder with an expression I couldn't read. The animal thing was worse. In Alaska, you learn quickly that wildlife is not cinematic. It doesn't wait in dramatic silhouettes. It appears all at once and at distances you immediately wish were greater. Over my second month, we had 3 encounters that should have ended in panic at minimum. A sow grizzly on a riverbank, a pair of wolves shadowing a snow machine trail at dusk, and a bull moose that had already flattened a field shed near a village fuel dump. Each time the animals behaved as if I occupied a different category of existence than food, threat, or nuisance. The bear lifted its head, fixed on me, then backed into alder without posturing. The wolves paced the tree line and would not cross it. The moose turned broadside to everyone else but kept its left eye on me the whole time, ears pinned, breathing hard, and then simply moved off as if yielding a narrow hallway. People noticed. Aurora employees were very good at not saying certain things in direct language, so the gossip took indirect forms. Conversations ended when I entered rooms. Somebody started leaving laminated rule cards in my locker, in my truck cab, once inside the med bag I had personally inventoried 10 minutes earlier. A village health aide asked if I had been marked in the old way, then apologized and refused to explain what she meant. Royce stopped volunteering for my shifts. The token stayed with me. That wasn't a decision either. The first time I tried to get rid of it, I tossed it into a trash compactor behind the operations building and listened to the machine cycle. That evening it was in the coin tray of my truck, dusted with frost. The second time I threw it into a braided channel of the Susitna on a day cold enough that exposed skin flashed numb. The water took it. I watched the current spin it under shelf ice. 2 mornings later I found it on my dresser beside my wedding band. I should explain the ring. I had been divorced almost 3 years and kept wearing the band out of habit when I worked. Patients trusted married men more. That isn't science. It was just something I believed because it saved time in chaotic scenes. My ex-wife used to say I was attracted to uniforms and explanations because both let me avoid talking about what hurt. She was probably right. By the time Lily vanished, I was already good at compartmentalizing. Good enough to mistake it for strength. When the token began returning, compartmentalization failed in strange places. I'd catch myself reaching for it without meaning to. During dispatch briefings, I'd feel the outline of it through my pocket and calm down before I had noticed I was anxious. My dreams changed texture. Not nightmares exactly. They had the administrative clarity of training videos. Snow, trees, a woman ahead of me, and the unshakable sense that I was performing a procedure I should have learned years ago. Grant cornered me in the gear room one night while I was checking airway kits. "You're carrying it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've tried not to." He leaned against the shelves, crossed arms roped with old frostbite scars, and studied me like an animal he expected to bolt. Grant was in his late 50s, though weather made him difficult to date. His beard had gone mostly white. He moved like a man who conserved heat and speech with equal discipline. "How long after Rule 1 before somebody disappears?" I asked. "Usually 3 days. Sometimes 2 weeks. It's been over a month." He nodded once. "That's why people are nervous." "Because I'm lucky?" "Because people who survive the wrong thing don't stay lucky forever." That line sat with me the rest of the shift. I started logging small incidents in a notebook I kept zipped inside my bunk bag. Times I found the token after discarding it. Scenes where patients seemed to know me before introductions. Dispatch echoes on weak signal calls that repeated my coordinates an extra time even when the official recording later showed no duplicate transmission. The strangest part was this. The more I expected punishment, the more it felt as if something had begun moving circumstances around me to prevent it. A med cabinet door should have crushed my hand. It slammed shut inches from my fingers. A hypothermic patient in a mining camp went into ventricular fibrillation, and I reached the defib pads before the monitor even finished alarming. Once, during a whiteout return from a village call, our GPS failed and the storm took the horizon away so completely it felt like driving through paper. I had never been on that trail before. Still, I told the driver to turn left at what looked like nothing at all. 200 yards later the beam found reflective stakes marking the safe route over overflow ice. The driver asked how I'd known. I almost said I remembered. That was when the idea first arrived in a form I could not dismiss. Not that something was after me. That something was keeping me. There is a vanity in believing you are chosen for destruction. It centers you in your own fear. This was different. This felt like belonging to a plan I had never consented to, one already in motion before I knew there had been a starting point. The worst moments were the quiet ones. Laundry room, vehicle bay, the few seconds between shutting off an engine and hearing whether the radio would speak again. In those moments I would press my thumb against the outline of the carving and feel a pulse that might have been my own. I began reviewing old incident files at night, partly because Aurora's internal archive was easier to access than Celia probably intended. Partly because I needed to know whether survival after Rule 1 had ever happened before. It had, sort of, but not in any way that made me feel safer. Aurora kept paper longer than most private services because paper still worked when networks didn't. The archive room was in the oldest section of the building, where the floor sloped slightly and the baseboard heaters clicked without warming much. Incident binders filled 3 walls. Older files were stacked in bankers' boxes marked by year and region. Supplemental material, personal notes, scene photographs, hand-drawn maps from before the current digital system, sat in unlocked cabinets because no one expected new hires to go reading 20 years of wilderness weirdness after midnight. They underestimated insomnia. At first I searched only for the terms that mattered to me: gift, wood, marker line 7, weather station, patient no name, duplicate coordinates. Then I broadened the search because the reports had a way of circling what they meant without naming it. They called incidents non-compliant patient behavior, impossible identification conflict, scene destabilization, thermal incongruity. Bureaucracy is one of humanity's more elegant forms of fear. It lets people stand beside the unspeakable and discuss it in categories. There were 43 files clearly connected to Rule 1 going back 28 years. Every outcome was bad. Sometimes the responder vanished during the next call. Sometimes they went missing off-duty. Once a medic returned from a fuel stop and his truck was found idling at the pump with both doors open and his coffee still in the cup holder. In several cases there were notebooks recovered from bunk rooms or vehicle cabs. Aurora had photocopied the pages and clipped them to the incident summaries like pathology slides. I read them one by one. Patient female approximate 40. Offered carved item. Declined. Later found same item in cargo pocket not mine. Heard my son outside cabin at 0200. My son died in 1997. No body heat. Breath visible from me, not from her. Smile delayed half-second after speech. If they ask where you've been, do not answer with years. That line appeared in 3 separate journals written a decade apart. Another note appeared even more often, sometimes copied as if from an earlier source nobody wanted to misquote. The dead aren't returning. Something else is learning how. One journal belonged to a paramedic named Vanessa Dreyer. She had broken Rule 1 near an ice road camp and survived 12 days. Her entries began clinically. Sleep hours, shift records, weather observations, and frayed into something intimate and ashamed. By day 8 she wrote that she kept hearing her brother in freezer compressors and radio static. By day 10 she described finding a wooden carving under her tongue on waking. By day 12 there was only one line repeated 3 times across the page until the pen tore it. If you accept the gift and survive, it already knows you. Vanessa disappeared between quarters and the vehicle bay during a routine equipment transfer. Security footage showed her walking out of frame. Nothing showed her entering the yard. Snow around the building held no prints beyond the ones she had made arriving. The conclusion in red ink: presumed taken. I sat in the archive room until my legs went numb from the heaterless floor and stared at that phrase. Presumed taken. Not dead. Not missing. Not attacked. As if the company had built a taxonomy for being removed from consensus reality. By then I had lived with the token nearly 7 weeks. I should have vanished by any precedent available. Instead, I found odd references to something more unsettling. Rare cases in which the subject was not taken promptly because, according to witness notes, contact appeared reciprocal. That phrase came up in only 2 files, both heavily redacted. One described a responder who claimed to recognize a patient before visual identification was possible. The other involved a trainee who repeatedly drew the same faceless wooden figure in margins long before his first flagged incident. Both files terminated abruptly. One subject disappeared after requesting leave. The second was transferred, according to the record, though no transfer destination was listed. I photocopied too much and hid it in my truck. I also started noticing small errors in the archive itself. Dates overwritten. Names misspelled one way in reports and another way in handwritten addenda. A patient listed deceased in one incident and later documented as having refused transport in another 3 years afterward. If I hadn't already been exhausted, I might have blamed clerical drift. Instead, I recognized the pattern from trauma work. When facts become painful, institutions rarely erase them cleanly. They layer contradictions until nobody trusts what remains. The file that bothered me most was not one of the dramatic ones. It was a rescue report from 19 years earlier involving a lost child recovered near the same abandoned weather station from my first call. Male, approximately 9 years old. Mild hypothermia. No lasting injury. Family declined extensive follow-up. Attached to the report was a grainy Polaroid of the scene. 2 responders stood near a tracked litter. Between them, bundled in an oversized parka, was the child. His face was blurred by glare and cheap film stock, but the slope of his shoulders, the shape of his left ear, and the cheap red knit hat with one torn tassel made my stomach turn over so hard I had to grip the edge of the cabinet. I owned that hat once, or had owned one identical enough that the distinction felt cowardly. I do not remember being lost in Alaska as a child. I would have said so under oath. Our family camped, yes, but always in maintained sites, never far from roads. That was the official story in my head, firm as a notarized statement. Seeing the photo did not change it all at once. It simply introduced a crack. Memory is not a vault. It's wet ground. Things sink, but they do not stop existing. I took the Polaroid to my room and stared at it until dawn. At breakfast, Grant sat across from me with black coffee and 2 aspirin laid neatly beside it. He watched me long enough to confirm I had not slept. "You've been in archives," he said. I said nothing. "You want advice?"
No.
He nodded like he respected the lie. Then he said, "Whatever you think you're looking for in there, make sure it wants to be found." It was a stupid sentence, almost superstitious, but the way he said it made my throat tighten. He wasn't warning me off the company. He was warning me about reciprocity, about search itself. That afternoon dispatch sent us to a diabetic emergency outside a trapping line cabin. Routine, except the patient's wife opened the door, saw me, and flinched so hard she dropped the glucose gel in her hand. "I know you," she whispered. I had never seen her before. She shook her head immediately, corrected herself, and would not meet my eyes again. On the flight back, I pulled the token from my pocket and looked at it in the cabin light. The carving was crude, almost childish. A body, a head, no features. Yet every time I held it, I felt the same disorienting intimacy, as if it had been shaped around my own grip years before. By then, the question had changed. At first, I wanted to know why Rule 1 hadn't killed me. Now I wanted to know what had recognized me soon enough to spare me. The first memory came like weather. Not dramatic, not cinematic. It moved in quietly and altered pressure. I was in the bunkhouse bathroom shaving when the mirror fogged from somebody's shower down the hall. For a second, the condensation on the glass arranged itself into vertical streaks that looked like tree trunks, and with that came a sensation so complete I had to grip the sink to stay upright. Snow inside my boots, mittens soaked through, the sound of my own breathing trapped in a scarf. A child's terror, preserved intact. By the time I blinked, the mirror was only a mirror again, but the body memory stayed. That night I dreamed the rest, not as a sequence, as a place I had once left and was now re-entering. I was small enough that the trees seemed structural rather than natural. Snow stood waist-deep on either side of a narrow depression where something had passed before me. Twilight had gone blue. I remember crying because crying was warmer than silence. Then I saw the woman between the spruces. She stood without snow collecting on her shoulders. Not close, not far. The same woman from the weather station, except younger and older at once, as though age on her was an agreement she had not finalized. She crouched so our eyes matched. In the dream, I could not see her face clearly, only the conviction that I knew it and always would. "You walk too far," she said. I remember showing her my bare wrist because I had lost a mitten. That detail returned so sharply I woke clutching my own hand. Then, in the dream, she gave me something small and wooden to hold. "Take this," she said, "so I can find you if you forget." I woke before dawn with the token under my pillow. I had not put it there. Sleep deprivation will make you superstitious because it erodes the labor required for skepticism. But what unsettled me wasn't the object appearing again. It was the recognition blooming around the memory like frost on a window. Not certainty exactly, more like a buried corridor reopening one room at a time. I called my mother that morning. We had not talked much about Lily in the previous year because grief had given our family specialties. Mine was research. Hers was silence. My father's was fix-it optimism so brittle it became anger under pressure. Old families don't stop loving each other. They simply develop efficient ways to avoid detonating. "Did I ever get lost when I was little?" I asked. There was a pause long enough for the line noise to become noticeable. "What kind of question is that? Just answer it." Another pause. "You wandered off once," she said. "Near Paxson, I think. Your father found you." "Dad found me?" "Yes." The lie arrived too quickly. I knew it because I recognized the rhythm. I had inherited it. Later that day, I drove to storage units in Wasilla where my parents kept the sort of boxes people swear they'll organize after retirement. Old tax returns, church programs, school photos, camping permits, Lily's soccer trophies, my father's army duffel full of socks so old the elastic had surrendered. I used the spare key I wasn't supposed to have because violating minor boundaries had become my family's native dialect. In a plastic tub labeled Trips 1990s, I found what I was looking for, without knowing I'd been looking for it. A disposable camera envelope. Receipts from a campground near the Denali Highway. A yellowed map with coffee rings and my mother's handwriting. And a folded incident slip from Alaska State Troopers documenting recovery of a lost minor male approximately 9 years old near a decommissioned federal weather site. Recovered by private contractor before trooper arrival. The contractor's company name had been blacked out with marker so old it had gone brown. My father had not found me. Someone else had. At the bottom of the tub was a notebook I recognized as Lily's from college. She used to buy the same cheap black composition books and fill them with field notes, bad sketches, book lists, and the sort of private speculations she pretended were research. The notebook was half full. Most pages had nothing to do with me. Then, near the back, I found a section headed only by coordinates. Marker line 7 didn't appear by name, but the latitude and longitude clusters overlapped the area around the abandoned station. Several pages referenced Noah's missing day. I had told her. At some point before she vanished, I had told my sister about the thing I could not fully remember. Not in useful detail, just enough to infect her curiosity. One entry was underlined twice. He still thinks Dad found him. Mom backed the story. Why? Another. If there really was a private rescue company working that far out in the 90s, somebody kept it quiet. And then, for pages later, the sentence that made me sit down on the concrete floor of the storage unit because my knees stopped negotiating. If Noah was found near the station, and if the woman gave him something, then maybe people don't disappear there at random. Maybe they get remembered. Lily's last hiking route had not been impulsive. She had gone looking for my missing day. For 5 years I had told myself I was hunting a random wilderness loss with the desperation of a brother who couldn't accept statistical reality. In truth, I had been following a chain of omissions that began inside my own family. My mother had lied. My father had reinforced it. I had supplied the spark Lily carried north, then buried it deep enough that by the time she disappeared I could no longer recognize my own role in it. That night, back in company housing, I spread the documents across my bed. The weather station appeared in old survey maps, old distress reports, village warnings copied phonetically by outsiders who didn't understand the language well enough to catch nuance. The region recurred across decades, but not as an ancient cursed place, not in the storybook way outsiders prefer. It was recent by Alaskan standards. Active. Evolving. Something there had not slept in the wilderness for centuries. Something had been growing within living memory. And somehow, impossibly, it had touched me first. When I finally slept, the dream returned. The woman in the trees. The token in her palm. Only this time Lily stood beside her, older than the memory allowed, watching me with an expression I knew too well from childhood. Affectionate, impatient, disappointed that I needed things explained twice. "You told me to go," she said. I woke with tears on my face and no honest way to determine whether the accusation came from my guilt or from something clever enough to use it. By then winter had deepened. The light was brief and colorless. Dispatch calls seemed to arrive from farther out. Grant had started checking the mileage on my assigned truck before and after every shift. I noticed because, once you realize you are being monitored, you start seeing the tenderness inside surveillance. He wasn't trying to protect me. He was counting how far the problem had spread. Grant invited me to Fish Camp Coffee, which in Alaska meant coffee strong enough to strip paint and an implied request that I follow him somewhere private. He chose the equipment shed behind the main hangar, where spare litters and aviation fuel absorbent were stored beside shelves of seasonal gear. The heater barely worked. Our breath stayed visible. Grant shut the door, leaned against it, and held out his hand. "The token." "No." He looked unsurprised. Then listened carefully. Grant had been with Aurora since before it was called Aurora. Back when it was a smaller contractor with a different name and fewer aircraft, the work had been nastier and less regulated. No GPS backhaul worth mentioning. No satellite text integration. Weather windows guessed more than predicted. He had lost partners to exposure, rotor wash, thin ice, and one event he described only as false retrieval, which was not a term any medical certification teaches. What happened after Rule 1 used to be simpler, he said. People took something they were offered. They started hearing familiar voices. Then they went where they shouldn't and never came back. And I didn't. No. So why am I being treated like I'm infectious? He rubbed at the scar tissue on the back of one hand, thinking. Because disappearance is containment. Survival is development. I wanted to laugh at how insane that sounded, but the archive room had ruined my threshold for insane. Grant continued. The company tells new people the rules are for safety. They're not. They're for management. We reduce contacts. We reduce pattern formation. We keep whatever is out there from getting better at being somebody. Somebody like Lily? His eyes flicked to mine, then away. That told me enough. You knew about my sister. I knew her file touched ours. Did you send her out there? No, he said it immediately, and I believed him, which only made the rest worse. But I knew what region she was walking into. My hands were already shaking. I tucked them under my arms before he could see. Grant took a breath and said the part he had brought me here to say. Everyone who survives Rule 1 changes. Some start sleepwalking toward line camps. Some hear names over open frequencies. Some begin recognizing the wrong dead. A few get useful. Protective weather. Missed accidents. Animals backing off. The phenomenon invests in them. Invests. Picks a route. Learns through them. I thought of the helicopter crate, the avalanche, the overflow trail I had somehow known. You're telling me it's been keeping me alive. I'm telling you that when it protects someone, it's because losing them would cost it something. There are moments when disgust and relief become indistinguishable. I had spent weeks bracing for pursuit. To hear I was being preserved instead produced a shame so immediate it felt physical. What do you do with people like me? I asked. Grant didn't answer. Then I understood and asked again, differently. What did you do with the others? He held my gaze this time. No teatrix. No epalegi. I reported them when I had to. To who? To the people who still understand the difference between rescue and quarantine. I stared at him. He went on in that same flat voice. A few co-workers over the years broke rules and survived too long. Dispatch sent them on calls with known anomalies and no secondary support. Sometimes aircraft didn't launch when they should have. Sometimes GPS trails got corrupted. Sometimes the weather was allowed to settle. You abandoned them. We prevented spread. That sentence turned the room. For a second I felt the shed stretch away from me like a corridor in a bad dream. Grant saw it happen and pushed forward anyway, as if gentleness would have been an insult. You think I enjoyed it? I think you built a career around it. Something moved in his jaw. Anger, maybe, or old pain worn smooth. I built a life that outlasted people who wanted explanations more than limits, he said. That place beyond marker line 7, call it an intelligence, a disease, a copy machine for grief. I don't care what term comforts you. I've watched it get better because people insisted on treating it like a victim. They went closer. They talked. They recognized faces. They let it practice. And the rules stop that. The rules starve it. That was the first coherent explanation anyone had offered. It would have been almost convincing if he had not also confessed to sacrificing co-workers in the name of containment. Why tell me now? I asked. Because you're nearing a threshold. He nodded toward my pocket. And because once it starts protecting you openly, it assumes you're already partly inside. I wanted to hit him then, not because violence would solve anything, because he had spoken the secret part aloud. The part of me that already suspected my luck was a kind of consent. What threshold? He hesitated. First real hesitation I had seen in him. You begin to feel connected. Places make sense before they should. Certain voices sound closer than they are. The wilderness stops behaving like a backdrop and starts behaving like a body that knows where you are. That described too much of the last month to be accidental. Grant reached into his coat and produced something wrapped in wax paper. He set it on the shelf between us and unfolded it. Inside was another carving like mine, though more worn, the wood nearly black with age. I took one, he said, years ago, only limiting it. That left a silence big enough to hear the heater tick. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded borrowed. You're not a survivor. You're a caretaker. Grant looked tired enough to be honest. Yes. The words settled between us like a verdict. When I left the shed, the cold outside felt cleaner than the air within. I walked to my truck, sat behind the wheel, and realized with absolute clarity that every warning I had received since my hiring had been shaped not by people trying to save me, but by people trying to decide whether I was still killable. That realization should have driven me away from the station, the archives, Lily, all of it. Instead, it did what truth often does when it arrives too late. It removed the last moral excuse for not going farther. After Grant's confession, I stopped treating Aurora's rules as instructions and started treating them as evidence. Evidence behaves better than folklore. It has patterns. It leaves constraints. Rule 1. Never accept gifts from patients beyond marker line 7. Rule 2. If dispatch repeats your coordinates twice, immediately leave the area. Rule 3. Never transport a patient who refuses to give a name. Rule 4. If you encounter someone listed as deceased, do not acknowledge recognition. Taken separately, they looked like superstitions grown around dangerous field conditions. Taken together, they formed a shape. Each rule limited a kind of intimacy. Gifts created reciprocity. Repeated coordinates fixed location through shared attention. Names stabilized identity. Recognition confirmed.